In this lesson, we're going to take a brief look at how to set up your project so you've got a good workflow from the off, okay? So the first thing I like to do is obviously listen to the tracks loads and loads and loads of times. Now in lesson one, I've actually given you guys some house stylistic fingerprints for you to kind of have a look at. Now that's going to help you kind of make judgment calls about what kind of features need to go into your house music, what kind of tempo it needs to be, what key signature it needs to be, whether major or minor, what kind of instrumentation you need to have in your track, how that needs to be arranged, and so on, and just some general ideas about production and things like that. It's quite an extensive list. But it's really, really useful in kind of getting you over a few of those hurdles, especially if you're not used to composing or arranging in house. Okay, so with that in mind, I've listened to Pump Up the Volume. I've also listened to One Nation Army, and I've come up with this structure. It's probably not going to be my final structure, but I do like to do this. I do like to kind of get my map sorted out as early as possible, and then I find when I'm just laying down the blocks or the chunks of music, it just makes it that much easier for me to kind of see where I'm at, see what I can repeat, see what I can reuse, see what I can develop, and so on. So although this may change, this is not a bad way of looking at it. Now both One Nation Army and Pump Up the Volume have these kind of 8-bar phrases. Actually, One Nation Army is really 16, but I can break it very evenly into 8, and it does work. Pump Up the Volume has this kind of, it's kind of through composed, I guess, where it doesn't really have a verse, it doesn't really have a chorus, it just keeps developing, and instruments are added, instruments are taken away, samples are added, samples are taken away, a bit more progression, and so on. So that's what I've called it: intro, development 1, development 2. Then they have this break where you pump up the volume, and so on. So, and I wanted to include that break. I'm sure we can do something really nice with that break and that little kind of instrumental middle hook thing that they've got going on in Pump Up the Volume. Now, I've deliberately included this extended intro because of the way that One Nation Army works. I wanted it to kind of build up with one instrument, then 2 instruments, and then the first development comes in. And I thought that would be quite a nice way to start and show that I've kind of used these developmental ideas. Now, if we scan to the end, you'll see that my track, if we look up here, is 2 minutes 15 seconds. Now that is completely appropriate. If I want to make it longer, that's absolutely fine, but as long as my arrangement is between 2 and 3 minutes, that's absolutely good. So we can make it longer, but it's not completely necessary. I mean, I could actually add another development before the outro, and that would be fine, and I may even do that. So we'll see. You might see some changes as we go through. Another element that I've taken from house is the tempo. Now, typical house tempos are between 120 and 140. Unfortunately for me, Pump Up the Volume is 113. So I've got to make a decision fairly early on. Do I carry down the path of Pump Up the Volume and make it 113, or do I make it more typical of house and make it faster than 120? Currently, I've gone for 128. I'm going to see how my drums pan out on whether I decide to keep it that way or not. And the benefit of using MIDI in these early stages is that the tempo will always match, okay? So it will adjust itself based on the tempo that you're doing. I wouldn't advise kind of mixing it up too much because it will change the whole thing, but we've probably got a couple of instruments to put in before we have to make a firm decision on that. Currently sticking with 128. Both Pump Up the Volume and One Nation Army have a 4/4 time signature, so that was nice and easy. So I've kept the 4/4. I haven't put any harmonic stuff in yet, but I have started patching in all of my instruments. Now I've looked at the stylistic fingerprints for house, and I've looked at what's included in the song, and I've kind of mixed them up. These are my first ones. Now the specification does say something like you have to have a minimum of 6 instruments. So straight away I've got 8, so I'm going to be in good stead for that. These drum machines tend to happen a lot in house music, so although I've got a drum machine here, I'm probably also going to use another drum machine for my samples and percussion. Now, if you listen to Pump Up the Volume, you'll notice that most of it is drum machine, and that's all it is actually. And then even the samples from the vocals are probably patched in via drum machine. So it makes it really quite easy. Once you get these samples into place, you're going to have a lot of fun with this. And depending on the way you think about samples. As long as they're not used as continuous audio, you may even be able to slot in some nice single phrases in there as well. I think the specification this year is it's not allowed to be longer than a bar, so you've probably got maybe 2 or 3 words that you can fit in. So that's good. So I'm going to use a minimum of 2 drum machines, but I might even use 3. I've also got this piano stab thing that's happening in Pump Up the Volume. I'm going to take my vocals in some kind of arrangement from the song. This riff that's on the guitar in the song, I'm going to put onto a synthesizer to make it more appropriate for my style. I'm going to add a second synth, plus I'm going to add some string pads, so just chords that pad out the whole texture. Now, this bass is coming straight from Pump Up the Volume. I'm going to take their constant lick on their bass and I'm going to pretty much use it. I'm going to have to manipulate it so it fits with my chord structure, but I don't think that's going to be a massive issue. It's just a few note changes there and I should be good to go. Now, excuse me. Now, one thing I recommend to you guys to do straight away is, because we are developing this piece and then we have to write about it, once you start doing too much, you'll start forgetting where you're at. Now, Logic has a fantastic feature. If you come over here, and if you're in Logic 9, it might be slightly different. If you come over here, you can click on this notes section, you can press edit, and you can actually write your notes in. Now, this is fantastic because what I've done here is my question 9, my question 10 is basically I'm describing the features that I'm using, and I can write as much or as little as I want. So at the moment, I'm just writing little lines, but I will extend these and I'll make them more bulky. Now, the logbooks does say take either 4 of these elements, so rhythm, texture, pitch, dynamics, and so I can't remember, instrumentation. My feeling on that is absolutely you focus in on those, but there's no harm in writing a little bit about all of them. I always tell my students to kind of write about 10 points. Now, my feeling about the 10 points is that there are 10 marks for each. So if you say what you've used and say how you've used it and developed it in one bullet point, that's, in my eyes, that's 1 mark. Okay, so what you've used, how you've used it. And that goes for both questions, what you've used, how you've used it. And if you explain one bullet point well like that, and it's appropriate and it's in your song, so you're not just making this stuff up because it says so in the house checklist, it actually exists in your song, and maybe you could even identify where you've put it in your song. That gives the examiner just a little bit more to go on. So what you've taken, how you've developed it, where it is in the song maybe, 10 points for each of those questions, 10 marks. It's really, really easy. There's no reason, if you develop your piece strong enough, there's no reason you shouldn't get all 20 marks. Now think about that. You get all 20 marks, you are well on your way. Write it down as you go along, as much detail as you want. What I tell my students to do is actually, once they've done all this, put it into a Word document. My feeling is 1 page sometimes isn't enough, and that's all they give you in the logbook. So I get my students to treasury tag their word sheet in, and they just write on the sheet, see attached. And as long as you title it, this is question 9 or question 9 plus the actual question, make sure it's really obvious for the examiner to kind of find that attached sheet as well, because they do hate that. They hate looking for attached sheets. So making sure that it's obvious. If you have attached sheets, make sure it's in the right place, make sure it's titled, and make sure where the examiner will look first is documented that there is an attached sheet for that. There you go. So keep this, then put it into a Word document. Make sure it's all typed nicely so you don't lose any marks there for bad writing and spelling. And that's done. Now that is pretty much how I've set up my track. So making sure I've got tempo, make sure I've got time signature, making sure it fits within the 2 and 3 minutes, setting out using the marker track, using this plus button, each of the sections. I also colorize them just using this button here. Inputting my first notes, and then I'm away. My next lesson, we're going to look at the first drum machine, getting our first basic rhythm in. Because once we've got the rhythm in, we're going to be flying after that, okay? And I'll explain more about that in the next lesson, so see you then.